we're going to take a close look at the most important week in human history. A week that changed everything. That the world before, the dates before March 29th, 33 AD, and April 5th, 33 AD, the world was changed for absolutely ever. Beforehand, we've got this small town country shaman healing simple folk. And after, we have the birth of the largest religious, philosophical, and ideological movement the world had ever seen. Everything changes on that specific week in history. Now we're going to conduct a rational investigation. When we look at history, we use a lot of the tools that modern day police use. When we see witnesses, we need to figure out, are these witnesses really credible? How do we analyze what they're saying? Witnesses sometimes can be contradictory, sometimes they could be collaborative, and sometimes they can be honest and complimentary. Well, how do we tell the difference? All right, let's just run a theoretical situation here. Let's say that right here, today, this morning, we are going to hatch a plot. We're going to do an insurance scam. So what we're going to do is we're going to tell a story about how an armed gang of thieves came in here right on stage and robbed me. And then, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, we'll share in the insurance money. Okay, somebody calls the cops. The police come in. One of the first things they're going to do is they're going to split us all up. So we're not going to be able to talk to each other. And they are going to start asking questions. And questions, maybe some that we haven't even thought about. Well, what were these thieves wearing? And I'm going to, they were wearing like ninja costumes. This guy over here, he might be saying jeans and black leather jackets. This person over here, yeah, they were wearing, black hoods and Halloween costumes. All right? The more the police ask us questions and the more details we get into, the more and more they're going to see that none of these accounts agree with one another and that we've just made all this up. That's called contradictory testimony. Okay, say we're aware that might happen. So we're going to spend like the next 2 hours rehearsing our story, going over every single detail so we're all on the same page. What these guys are wearing, every word that they speak, every move that they make. All right, and then we call the cops. Will that work out better? Actually, it won't. They're also trained to detect collaboration. You see, real witnesses all have different perspectives and all notice different things. So they never tell exactly the same story. This person over here might notice what they were wearing. This person over here might overhear what they said. This person over here might be more in tune with their movements. And what the police will find in a real case is that all these different stories will actually fit together to form a clear picture. Unlike a BS story, the more questions they ask, the more the story is going to make sense. If we're all telling exactly the same story, they're going to pick up on that even faster than they're going to pick up on contradiction, and they're going to know, and we're going to be busted. Okay, so we're going to use these same techniques to look at the witnesses of that specific week. Now, I'm going to introduce these witnesses. The first witness that we're going to be using is Matthew. Now, Matthew was a tax collector, and as a finance guy, not surprisingly, his gospel is very, very meticulous and very detailed. Typical financial kind of guy. He was an eyewitness to most of the events in the gospel story. However, personally, because he was viewed as a Roman collaborator, a sinner, and a party animal, no Jew in the first century would have ever believed anything Matthew had to say. Second is John. John's a teenager, so he's we're not so sure about him because of that, but he was an eyewitness to everything, including the trial. So he saw the trial, and he was close personal friends with Jesus' family, so he had access to a lot of good information. The third we have is Mark. Mark is not a personal eyewitness. However, we've got lots of evidence, both internal evidence and external evidence, that point to the fact that Mark was Peter's personal secretary. And so when Mark writes his gospel, he's actually writing down Peter's eyewitness account. Okay, then there's Luke. Luke is a Greek doctor, and he was not an eyewitness either. However, he says, and he says this right in his gospel, that what he did is he went and he conducted a very thorough investigation, interviewing lots of different sources to put together his gospel. So while he's not an eyewitness, it's all based on eyewitness accounts. Unfortunately, in the first century, because Luke was a Gentile, no self-respecting Jew would ever eat with this guy, never mind really listen to him. But those are the challenges that they faced. All right, let's take with what we know, and we start off on Sunday, March 29th, 33 AD. Now, what we have on this day from the Gospels is a story of the triumphal entry. Triumphal entry, what we have happening is from the east side of the city, Jesus coming in, and there's crowds of people welcoming him. And they're saying Hosanna, and they're waving palm leaves, and they're saying Hail to the King of Israel. So there's this massive and very politically charged event happening on the east side of the city. But what we find when we look at sources outside of the Bible, we find there's not one triumphal entry, but two of them. On this side of the city, Pilate comes to town with a large contingent of Roman soldiers, Roman banners, great fanfare to celebrate the power of Rome. Any common man in the street would have seen the contrast of Hail to the King of Israel and Hail to Caesar. And the potential for violence and a spark of revolution was very, very obvious. And it was obvious to the Jewish authorities as well. The Jewish authorities, their political position depended on Roman support. If there was a revolution, if the revolutionaries won, because they're Roman collaborators, they would be out. If there was a revolution and the Romans won, well, they weren't able to keep the peace, so they're out. So all their wealth, all their prestige, all their political power depends on them able to keep the peace. And what they see here is a disaster. And so the Jewish authorities get together and they say, you know what? We need to take care of this Jesus guy. And Caiaphas, the high priest, says this startling statement. He says this: it's better that one man die for the people than to have the whole nation destroyed. Now let's be a little bit skeptical here. How do we know Caiaphas said that? What reason do we believe that this is true? Do we have any witnesses to what Caiaphas would have said? Well, it turns out we have two possibilities. One is that we have Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea, who are members of the Sanhedrin, but secret followers of Jesus. They respect Jesus, they follow his teaching, but they ain't letting anybody know. And when they do meet with Jesus, it's always at night. Two, John has personal friends on Caiaphas' household staff. And we're going to see he'll exploit that relationship a few days later. So we do have an inside scoop at what's going on here, so we can justify that testimony. Not only that, quite frankly, let's cut some Caiaphas a little bit of slack here. It's a reasonable thing to say. They can obviously see that this is trouble and there's got to be some way to solve it. What they decide, though, is that this is too dangerous to act because of the crowds. Large crowds here. Jerusalem, this is Passover season, and people from all over the countryside have poured into Jerusalem. And in fact, Jews from all over the empire have come to visit Jerusalem. The population has more than doubled. Trying to move against Jesus at this time would be a disaster. So they make a decision that they're going to wait after Passover, after the crowds have dispersed, before they make their move against Jesus. Tuesday, March 31st. Jesus begins teaching. Now, Jesus spent 3 years up and down the countryside. The countryside knows who Jesus is. He's very famous. He's a famous miracle worker, and everybody wants to hear what Jesus says. The atmosphere is absolutely electric at this time. Problem for the Jewish authorities is that Jesus is using his celebrity to discredit and attack the Jewish authorities, pointing out their hypocrisy. This is not okay for the Jewish authorities. And they've got a big problem at their hands. But because of their fear of the large crowds, they just bite their lip. Wednesday, April 1st. Jesus is talking to his disciples, and he reveals to them that he has come to Jerusalem for one reason, and that's to die here. Now, the disciples are shocked, and some of them think, well, maybe Jesus is speaking in riddles, because sometimes I don't understand what the guy says. But Judas Iscariot has a moment of clarity. You see, Judas Iscariot has hung out with Jesus for the last 3 years because he thinks that Jesus is the Messiah. He thinks that Jesus is going to be leading a conquering army, that Jesus is going to be setting up a new government. And if Judas Iscariot can attach himself to Jesus, when the new government comes, Judas is going to be rich and powerful. But what Judas realizes on this day is that Jesus isn't coming to be a conqueror, but he's coming to be a martyr. And Judas is furious. He's wasted 3 years of his life to follow a suicidal maniac. And Judas marches off, meets with the high priest, and offers his services to them, that he will help them find an opportunity to kill Jesus. Now, while the Jewish authorities gladly accept Judas's help, there's a question here. Why do the Jewish authorities need Judas at all? What could he possibly supply them that they didn't already have? It's not like Judas is some kind of common informant who's going to lead them to Jesus' secret hiding place. Jesus wasn't in hiding. Every night since they arrived, Judas and his disciples have been staying in Bethany, which is just 3 kilometers to the east of town. Staying at Bethany every night and coming in. Everybody knows this. His movements aren't a secret. And because he's staying outside of town, any one of those nights, the Jewish authorities could set up an ambush. They just wait in the middle of the night and go to Bethany. Nobody would know. There's something else that has to be going on here. Now, we think about it, they do admit that, you know what, they are afraid of the crowds. But that doesn't explain their inaction, why they're still sticking to the after Passover plan. I submit that there's another thing that they're afraid of, that there's a deeper and far more potent fear at work here. And that is that the Jewish authorities are afraid of Jesus personally. See, one of the interesting things is when we look outside of the Bible to hostile Jewish sources, the hostile Jewish sources never call Jesus a fraud. They never call him a phony. They don't ever accuse him of having fake miracles. All of them acknowledge his power. What they do claim is that his power was the result of sorcery. The Jewish leaders don't deny Jesus' miracles because they find his miracles undeniable. They believe in Jesus' abilities maybe even more than his own disciples do, and that is why they don't move. And we're going to see as we look more into stories that this explains a great deal of their actions. All right, Thursday, April 2nd, 33 AD, the Last Supper. Something is going to happen at the Last Supper that changes everything. Now, we've heard the story of the Last Supper before, but we always look at it in the rearview mirror. We always look at it as a past event and maybe look at it through theological eyes, but we don't look at it from their perspective, from the first time it happened. What we see is that something happened during the Last Supper that changes everything. Something happens and something is said that launches Judas into action. Something happens that the high priests get unexpected news, and we'll see them get into a hurried panic. They're going to abandon their plans of attacking Jesus after Passover, and they're going to try this desperate attempt to get him that very night. What happened at the Last Supper that could have possibly changed everything in Judas and the priest's mind? Well, looking at it through that lens, what do we see? Jesus, during the Last Supper, takes the loaf of bread and he breaks it and he says, "This is my body broken for you." He takes the cup and he says, "This is my blood poured out as a sacrifice to you." He tells them, "I will not drink with you again until my Father's kingdom has come." What Jesus reveals to them, and specifically to Judas, is that Jesus is willing to die. Jesus is not going to be putting up a fight, and he's willing to die that very evening. That's the piece of news that sends Judas running out into the night. Now, from the disciples' perspective, they have no idea what's going on. They think that Judas just went out to pay the bill because, he's the group treasurer. They don't think anything of this. And they go to the Garden of Gethsemane next. Now, that's a logical move because if they're eating in town, they're staying in Bethany. The Garden of Gethsemane is just outside of town on the way to Bethany. So they're waiting in the garden, waiting for Judas to get back from whatever he's doing. Now, they end up waiting in the garden for hours and hours and hours and hours. They get sleepy. They start going to sleep. Jesus tells them, try to stay awake. They still go to sleep. Why do they wait in the garden for so long? Well, the gospel writers don't give us a clue. They don't tell us anything. However, what we find when we are looking at legitimate first witness testimonies is that there might be funny things that happen in a witness's testimony that will be explained, because the witness doesn't know, by other evidence will make the picture seem clear. And I think we can use our knowledge of the time and evidence outside of the Bible to fill in some gaps here. See, what must have happened is Judas runs off to Caiaphas the high priest. And he gives them this special news, that Jesus will not resist arrest. Now, Caiaphas has a lot to do. He needs to quickly gather all of his cohorts, and they need to have a discussion and make some pretty big decisions. Is Jesus really willing not to put up a fight? We got Passover coming up in 24 hours. Is it possible for us to conduct a trial and have him executed in such a short time? Time is running out. We can't execute anybody without Roman support. Can we get the Romans on board? In any kind of Jewish trial, the only people who are permitted to arrest anybody are the witnesses to the crime. The only people who are even to prosecute anybody in Jewish court are the witnesses of the crime. The only people who are even able to question the accused are the actual eyewitnesses of the crime. Where are they going to get these false witnesses? How are they going to be able to coach them in time to endure cross-examination at a trial? How are they going to do the arrest? They've got lots and lots of work to do. So I'm sure after a meeting, and it might have been a long one, when they decide, okay, they're going to try this out, messengers would have been sent out all over the city to try to pull this together. They would have to go to the homes of all the members of the Sanhedrin, wake them up, tell them that we've got to have an emergency trial at night, which wouldn't have made anybody happen, is highly irregular. So they need to gather the Sanhedrin together. They need to go to Pilate's door, and there's very few people who can knock on Pilate's door in the middle of the night and live to tell the tale. But they've got to get Pilate in on this, and there's good evidence that that's in fact what they did. They would also have to find their false witnesses. They'd have to coach those false witnesses, try to get their stories straight, and then they would have to get an arresting party. Now, because, as I mentioned, that they're afraid of Jesus, those witnesses are not willing to go arrest them themselves. And so what they end up having to do is they need to hire soldiers for this arresting party. All of this is going to take time. And this explains, when you just think about the logical things that they would have to do in order to launch this last-minute plan, explains why they're waiting in the garden for so long. Well, when the arrest happens, the Garden of Gethsemane, it's located up on the Mount of Olives. And so the arresting party would have had to come from the city down through the valley and up to the garden. The arresting party is huge. It's described as being a crowd. They've got torches, they've got lanterns, they've got swords, they've got clubs, they've got Roman soldiers, they've got temple soldiers, plus religious leaders and their servants, all of them armed. That's a large, clattering group of people moving through the night. Jesus would have been in an excellent position to see them coming from a long ways away. There's no lights in the garden, they're in the trees. It would be very easy for Jesus to slip out into the night. But that's not what happens. Now, what does happen is still surprising. When this overwhelming large force comes to Jesus, When they first meet him, they do nothing. We see that they are frightened. And even when Peter draws his sword and chops off somebody's ear, they don't draw their swords to start fighting. They're still stunned. What we see is evidence of just their fear. And I don't know, maybe their large numbers even worked against them. They would have heard the stories of Jesus' miracles and his power, and maybe heard the accusations that he was a sorcerer. And when they say, well, hold a second, how powerful is this guy that we need all these soldiers? Okay, what we see is that arrest is very, very nervous people. The only reason the arrest succeeds is because Jesus calms everybody's down, heals the guy's ear, and goes off willingly. Jesus facilitates his own arrest. Well, what happens next is what is literally the greatest trial in human history. Not only is this legal trial the most famous trial in human history, but it's also the most consequential. It's the one that makes an enormous difference in the history of our world. Well, Mark lets us know how the trial starts off. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. But they did not find any. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements did not agree. Okay, this tells us a couple of different things. One is that Caiaphas evidently did not have total control over the Sanhedrin. Now, it's politics. You're going to have enemies. Maybe some people were annoyed at being woken up in the middle of the night. I don't know. But evidently, at least a simple majority of the Sanhedrin wasn't willing to rubber stamp this. They were insisting on proper Jewish legal protocol. They were insisting on proper cross-examination of the witnesses. And then, just as today, when you have false witnesses and you start questioning them about the details, false witnesses, because they're independently fabricating stories as they go along, false witnesses are going to contradict each other. And that is exactly what we see happening here. The second thing this tells us is this is confirmation that this whole trial wasn't something that they had planned for a long time. No, this is proof that they're just whipping this together. This is a last-minute thing, and they have not had enough time to coach their witnesses. All right? Caiaphas still has a couple things up his sleeve. We look at both Mark and Matthew's testimony. Mark says, "Then some stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, 'I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another not made by man.'" Matthew records, "Finally, two came forward and declared, 'This fellow said, I am able to destroy the temple of God and rebuild it in 3 days.'" Okay, a lot of us have heard the story before, but we haven't taken a close look at these particular witnesses. The question is, are these accusations brazen lies, complete fabrications, or are they based on some element of truth? Unfortunately, nowhere in the Gospel of Matthew and nowhere in the Gospel of Mark do you see Jesus saying anything remotely like this. There's no clue where this is coming from. Remember how I said how legitimate witnesses, the more you bring more testimony and more information together, the more it makes sense? Well, in this case, we have to go to the Gospel of John. And when we go to the Gospel of John, we find Jesus said something 3 years earlier that confirms what this happened. This is what happened 3 years earlier. "Then the Jews demanded of him, 'What miraculous sign can you show us to prove your authority to do all this?' Jesus answered them, 'Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days.' The Jews replied, 'It's taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days?' But the temple he had spoken of was his body." Matthew and Mark's story only makes sense when you put together John's story. Then we've got a clear picture of what's actually going on here. But even with these other guys making their serious charges, and they are serious charges, these are charges of sorcery and sacrilege. Yeah, then they're punishable by death. But as Mark reveals, yet even then their testimony did not agree. Even these guys have not been coached enough. And under cross-examination by the Sanhedrin court, they find this isn't making any sense, and it's thrown out. Now, as I mentioned before, the way a Jewish court works, the only people who have the authority to arrest, prosecute, and question the accused are the eyewitnesses. And Caiaphas is all out of witnesses. By every legal standard, this trial has been a complete failure. They have failed to lawfully convict Jesus. Caiaphas makes a desperate gamble. And he does what's next. Then the high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Are you not going to answer? What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you?" But Jesus remained silent. Now, Jesus wasn't silent because he was scared. Caiaphas' question is an illegal question. He does not have the authority to ask Jesus a question. Jesus doesn't have to answer. And what Caiaphas has now done is that he's broken Jewish legal protocol as high priest in front of the whole Sanhedrin. He's just humiliated himself. And Jesus has let it happen. But Caiaphas has one last card to play. This is what he says next. The high priest said to him, "I charge you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God." Now, in Jewish legal protocol, he's got no right to question him. But there is a loophole here. There is something known as the oath of the testimony. And that is legally, if anybody charges you under oath by the living God, uses that phrase, you have to answer that question, whether it's legal or not. So Caiaphas is taking a big risk with this gambit. All Jesus has to do to utterly politically destroy his enemies and go free is answer this question, no. But how does Jesus answer it? Yes, it is as you say, Jesus replied. But I say to all of you, in the future you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, "He has spoken blasphemy. Why do we need any of these witnesses? Look, you've all heard the blasphemy. What do you think?" "He is worthy of death," they answered. The scene of the greatest trial of history has now become the scene of the greatest crime in history. What we are witnessing is something known as judicial homicide. Now, unfortunately, in dictatorships and tyrannies throughout history, judicial homicide is very common, where evil governments will manipulate the courts to do their dirty work. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, judicial homicide. However, although the gospel witnesses give us a close picture of this trial, there's a story here that they don't want to tell. There's questions that they are leaving unanswered on this very night. And that is, where are the disciples? Well, we do know where Judas is. Judas is with the arresting party. And the next day we can track his movements because Judas shows back up, gives the blood money back to the priest, and then goes and commits suicide. John, we're told, gains access to the trial because he knows some of the staff at Caiaphas' house. So John is here during the trial. We're going to see him through the crucifixion, and at the end of the crucifixion, we're going to see him taking care of Mary, the mother of Jesus. Peter followed John back into the city with the arresting party, managed by the skin of his teeth to gain access to the trial. But people started recognizing Peter. Peter was a loudmouth. People noticed that guy. And so Peter, to save his skin, starts saying, "Hey, I don't know Jesus at all," and denied him 3 times. Jesus realizes what he's done, and he becomes a broken man. And he leaves out into the night weeping. We don't see him again until Sunday morning. Now, the other question is, where are the 9? Matthew would have been one of the 9. He would have been in perfect position to say what happened to the 9, but no evidence of the 9 at all. We don't see the remaining 9 disciples at the trial, at the crucifixion, at the burial. We don't see him on Sunday morning at the open and empty tomb. Where are the 9? The next time we do hear anything about the 9 disciples, we find them Sunday night after the empty tomb. And what we find is most of them are barricading themselves in Bethany, afraid of Jewish authorities arresting them, and some of them even abandoning Bethany on the road further out to Emmaus to escape. Where were they in the meantime? Well, I think we can logically put together some of the clues based on what we know. First of all, they're up here on the Mount of Olives. The arresting party comes down and up and arrests Jesus. Now they're asleep, so they're awoken, they're startled, and they see soldiers everywhere, torches and lanterns. They see Judas betraying Jesus and Jesus being led off in arrest. They don't have access to the city because the arresting party is in between them and the city. All these nights, and they were on the way, they've been staying at Bethany. Their close friends, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, are there. They don't know what's going on. And in the night, in the trees, they would have had a perfect opportunity to escape, to run through the night back to Bethany. However, what would have happened once they got to Bethany? They would have talked to Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, but they would have noticed there's only 9 of them. Not only has Jesus gone off with Judas, but we're missing John and Peter. What would have they thought? Now, they might have been tempted, man, we got to get out of Dodge. We need to head back to Galilee. But not only are they not quite willing to abandon their Lord and their friends, but 3 of their own mothers are staying inside the city. They're caught in a rock and a hard place. They're terrified of going to the city. They think their friends have been arrested. But they can't run away either because their friends and their mothers are still there. When we track the movements of the women, we see the women who are staying in the city, they're at the trial and the crucifixion, but they didn't have an opportunity because nobody was able to move on Saturday because it was the Passover. The women had no way of passing word to the disciples in Bethany. So they're in this vacuum, afraid and in hiding. Well, Friday, April 3rd, the trial before Pilate. Now, each of the 4 Gospels give us different details to this trial, and it's cool because they all fit together to flesh out what happened. We don't really have time to go over all of that, but the trial before Pilate is the most historically certain event in all of the ancient past. There are more documents, the oldest documents, friendly documents and hostile documents, Jewish documents and Roman documents. First century Roman historians, governors, and even an emperor all acknowledge that the death and trial of Jesus was just a matter of Roman public record. So that's not really in question. But there is a very, very critical mystery here. Sunday, April 5th, 33 AD. The body is missing. Both friendly sources and hostile sources agree on this point. There is no body. Both of them tell tales of conspiracy. The authorities say the disciples have conspired and stolen the body. The disciples said that the authorities are guilty of a government cover-up. What's actually going on here? How can we possibly find out? Well, let's take a close look at the different competing theories here. Theory number 1 is that the authorities took the body. Well, this has an air of legitimacy about it, if we're honest. The authorities were in possession of Jesus when he was alive. The authorities put him to death. The authorities would have been in possession of the body. And we see from the trial, the authorities were fully aware of this whole 3-day resurrection thing. It would have made perfect sense of them to take the body and put him in some secret, secure tomb so that disciples couldn't have stolen the body and then fabricated some kind of a hoax. That would have made perfect sense. However, we see just a few days later Jerusalem is ablaze with stories of resurrection. People everywhere are talking about seeing the risen Jesus. And when a few weeks later, you see Peter with thousands of people right in the Temple of Courts with this newborn church. Things were radically getting out of hand. All the authorities would have needed to do is just go produce the body. Jesus did not raise from the dead. Here, he's right here. They could have finished this whole church problem just like that. Why didn't they? Because the authorities obviously did not have the body. Okay. Theory number 2, the wrong tomb. This is a very popular theory today. Take the perspective of the women. They're distressed. They've seen their Lord tried and executed. They arrive early Sunday morning to try to take care of the body, to make sure at least he has a proper burial. Very, very emotional time. They get there in the twilight, and they go to the wrong tomb. Instead of the sealed tomb that Jesus was actually in, they actually get confused and go to an empty tomb that was unused. And when they talk to the gardener says, "Oh, Jesus is not here." They misinterpret that. And they think that what the gardener means is that Jesus has risen from the dead. And so it's all based on a misunderstanding. All right? We have to admit, that sounds pretty plausible, doesn't it? However, theory number 2 has the exact same problems with it as theory number 1. Even if the women went to the wrong tomb, the authorities would know where they put him. And even if the authorities didn't know where they put him, considering the birth of the church, they would have been very, very motivated to find him. And they would have literally left no stone unturned to find that body. The wrong tomb doesn't work because the authorities were unable to produce that body. So this isn't a mistaken location issue. Theory number 3, the disciples stole the body. Now this is the official story. Outside Jewish sources all agree this is what happened. Jesus was the sorcerer, disciples stole the body. That's what's went down here. But does this actually make sense? In the Gospels, we see the debate going on. We see the authorities say that the disciples stole the body. The disciples counter, "How could we? You had guards at the tomb." The authorities counter that, "Yeah, but our guards fell asleep." The authorities counter that, "Yeah, but you bribed them to say that they fell asleep." So you got this he said, she said thing going on. Where does the evidence actually lead? What actually makes sense? Well, a question that I think that's very responsible for us to ask is, were the disciples in any kind of state of mind psychologically to pull this off? Well, we get a snapshot on how they're feeling by Luke on Sunday evening. While they're escaping from Bethany and heading out to Emmaus, we get this conversation. Somebody asks them, "Hey, what's going on? What kind of things are you guys upset about?" And they say this: "The things that happened to Jesus, the man from Nazareth," they said. "He was a prophet who did powerful miracles, and he was a mighty teacher in the eyes of God and all the people. But our leading priests and the other religious leaders handed him over to be condemned to death, and they crucified him. We had hoped he was the Messiah who would have come to rescue Israel. This all happened 3 days ago." Psychologically, we see a number of things here. We see a group of men who are afraid, who are terrified, and emotionally got mixed feelings. It's a mixture of admiration and disappointment. Yeah, you know what? Jesus was their friend, and he was a great prophet. But Jesus was not the Messiah. Are these men who are cowering away in Bethany, are they psychologically capable of inventing a story, ignoring all of their master's teachings, breaking back into the city, not rescuing their own mothers, overcoming a squad of soldiers, stealing the body, disposing of the body where it won't be found, and then concocting this get-rich scheme? Does this make sense from what we know of those men? I'm not sure. What about Peter and John? Peter and John are at least in the city. They would have physical access to the tomb. John, we see, last we hear of him, is right at the crucifixion, taking care of Jesus' mother. Peter, he's run off crying somewhere. Both of them are together Sunday morning at the open tomb. We don't know where they were before. Does it make sense that these two men decided to abandon their Lord's teaching? That they left the women? That they overpowered a squad of Roman soldiers? That the two of them rolled the stone, stole the body, disposed of the body, and then concocted this scheme? Does that make any sense? Well, you know what? There are logical tools that we can use. See, authorities today, during an investigation, have some rule of thumbs that they go by on what it takes to put together a successful conspiracy. We know what conspiracies look like. People give false alibis all the time. What does a conspiracy need? It needs these things here. The first thing a successful conspiracy needs is small numbers. The more people you have in a conspiracy, the more loose ends you have, the more chances things are going to go wrong. Large numbers are a disaster to conspiracy because it only takes one person to crack, one person to slip up, and everything's blown. Large numbers, bad. You want a successful conspiracy? You need small numbers. 2, the conspirators need thorough and immediate communication between each other. This is why when there are witnesses to an event, when you have false alibis, the police will split you up. If you've got 2 accused criminals, the police will split them up. So they can't communicate. They don't know what the other one is saying. Successful conspiracies, they do know. They've got all their stories together. They know where each other are. They know they're not betraying each other. Okay, 3, a short time span. You might be able to keep alive for a short period of time, but the longer the lie, the more often you have to keep telling that lie, the more chances someone's going to slip up. Okay, close relations. Conspiracies between friends and acquaintances often fall apart. Blood is thicker than water, however, and you can have a successful conspiracy if you're family members and you guys will really have each other's back. Otherwise, conspiracies often break. Number 5, little pressure and obvious advantage. Conspiracies are always a means to an end. They're created for a reason, some kind of an advantage, either to protect themselves or to gain something. Because of that, conspiracies are always creatures of convenience. And as soon as that balance, where the cost of keeping the conspiracy is greater than the cost of denying it, the conspiracy will break. Okay, well, does this list here apply to what we know about the disciples? All these people who claim to have seen the risen Lord. Small numbers. We don't have small numbers. And it's not just the surviving 11. We have all the women, all their friends. We have dozens and even hundreds of people. Okay, that's not small numbers. Do they have thorough and immediate communication? Not during the length of the conspiracy, because all of these guys managed to keep their story for decades, and they were spread all across the empire keeping their story. There was no communication possible. Short time span? No, decades. These people went to their graves saying that Jesus rose from the dead. Close relations? Yes, there were a couple of pairs of brothers in Jesus' disciples, but the vast majority of these people claiming the resurrection were not related in any way. Little pressure and obvious advantage? These people didn't do anything to gain money and safety. They surrendered money and safety. Not only that, the pressure they faced was torture, imprisonment, and even death. Now, on very rare occasions, someone might be brave enough to die for something that they believe in. But nobody goes and voluntarily dies for something they don't believe in. That doesn't make any sense. Yet every single one of these people went to their graves, and most of them went to their martyrdoms, claiming their message that Jesus rose from the dead. Conspiracy just doesn't fit here. Okay? Then let's look at theory number 4, the resurrection. For the last couple of weeks, we've looked at philosophy, astronomy, physics, and biology, all looking for possible evidence for God's existence. And what we saw is not only is God's existence possible, but it's very, very, very probable. The evidence leads us to that. So if God very probably exists, then we need to take this theory seriously. And this is the theory that we get from the 4 Gospels. What we see is some problems, though. And the problem includes that the initial reports of the resurrection come from women. Now, in our day, that doesn't make much of a difference. But in the first century, a woman's testimony was considered to be so completely and utterly unreliable that legally they were not allowed to give testimony in a court of law, just inadmissible evidence. So that it's women telling this story would have been completely unbelievable to anybody living at that time. All right, there's other problems. For us, if there's one point in the whole story that we want these 4 witnesses to agree on, it's on the resurrection. This is where everything changes, is at this empty tomb. The entire weight of the Christian religion weighs on this one point. This is what decides whether we're dealing with the greatest hoax ever conceived or the greatest story ever told. It happens here. But what we do find is not that we have 4 stories in complete agreement, but we've got 4 completely different stories. Well, what do we know about the women? Well, on Thursday night, they're not at the Last Supper. They're not at the Garden of Gethsemane, so they have no knowledge of Jesus' arrest. So we don't see them at the trial. Certainly the first phase of the trial. However, on Friday morning, when the Roman trial is happening, Pilate actually sends Jesus to Herod's palace. And at Herod's palace, what we learn from Luke is that one of the women who works in Herod's palace, a woman named Joanna, is one of the disciples. She's a follower of Jesus. So that's when the women first find out that Jesus has been arrested, is when Jesus shows up at Herod's. Joanna then evidently is able to get news out to the other women, because when we see Jesus being crucified, the women are there. And they witness the crucifixion and they witness the burial of Jesus. Saturday, nobody moves because of Passover. And then Sunday morning, we see the women at the tomb. Now, what are we dealing with here? Well, let's take a look here. Here are our 4 different stories. We have Mark. His story starts at sunrise. Has Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome present. Doesn't mention any guards. Figures at the tomb, says there's a young man sitting inside. Matthew's story happens at a different time. He tells the empty tomb happening before dawn. Mentions Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mentions that the guards have all fainted. And mentions that there are angels sitting outside the tomb. Luke talks about this story happening at daybreak. Mentions Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Joanna, and other women. No mention of guards whatsoever. And mentions no one at the tomb first and then 2 men. John, when he tells the story, it's still dark. There's only Mary Magdalene there. Doesn't mention any guards and mentions 2 angels inside. What is going on at this tomb? Now, is there evidence of collaboration here? Are these 4 getting together and making sure they got their stories straight? Obviously not. These stories aren't straight at all. Is this evidence of contradiction? That these guys are obviously telling lies. They're obviously independently fabricating different stories that aren't going to mash up. Now, I've got a little confession to make. I did not come up with this chart. I got this chart actually from an atheist, and he put this chart together to demonstrate that the Gospels are false, that Jesus did not rise from the dead. The purpose of this chart is to prove Christianity false. Do these four contradict each other? Well, the author of this chart definitely thought so. But we've got a third option. Is it possible that these four different accounts actually make sense? That this is complementary rather than contradictory evidence? Well, there's a couple of details I want you to look at very closely. All of these different accounts happen at different times and involve different people. Where are these four guys getting their accounts from? I think there's evidence that each of them are relying on a different woman for their different events. Look at John. John happens the earliest. It's still dark, and it's Mary Magdalene. There's only one woman there, only one possible source for this story. So Mary Magdalene arrives first, does not see any guards, and sees two angels inside. All right. The next person is Matthew. He mentions it's before dawn, and he mentions Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James. Evidently, he's using this Mary as his source. She arrives after Mary Magdalene, takes a different route to the tomb, and she's the one who notices the guards who fainted. By the time the other Mary gets there, she sees an angel sitting outside. Our next person is Mark. His events happen after John's and Matthew's. And we've got a different woman added to the mix here that's independent of those ones. So it looks like Mark is using Salome as his witness. Salome doesn't see any guards. And by the time Salome gets there, there's a young man sitting inside. Luke's testimony happens last of all, at daybreak. And we've seen elsewhere in Luke's gospel that he regularly uses Joanna as one of his historical sources. It seems that he's using Joanna here today. And from Joanna's point of view, arriving later, doesn't see any guards and sees no one at first and then two men. What I submit and what I believe is that these are not contradictory testimonies, but they all mention different events from different perspectives, and you're seeing people moving, which is why they tell from these different snapshots why it looks different. But all of this is a decision that you need to make for yourself. I can't make this decision for you. You have to weigh this. You need to use your best judgment, your clearest version, as unbiased as you possibly can, to figure out, is this legitimate or not? One of the interesting things in this story is that the disciples themselves don't believe these women. When the women come to the disciples, they don't believe them at all. And what we see, the first thing they do when they hear from these women is they start barricading themselves. And some of them try to escape off to Emmaus. They don't believe. Whatever their psychological state of mind, they were not prepared to believe in the resurrection. And maybe because they were first century men, they weren't prepared to believe in the women. Yet, when we look at all of those disciples, we will see that something will radically change in their lives. We'll see them going from frightened kittens to fearless lions. We'll see a radical change in their personality. We'll see this disbanded, dysfunctional band of misfits become mighty history makers. What is the change between those two states of mind? Well, according to the disciples themselves, what changed their mind was not the testimony of the women, but what changed their mind is when they saw Jesus face to face. When Thomas put his hands into the nail marks of Jesus, that's when they believed. And that is what transformed these men from frightened and huddled to fearless. Throughout the rest of their lives, they would give up everything and boldly go and face torment and threats and prison and even death because they were so utterly convinced that Jesus had rose from the dead. You know, the funny thing is that it doesn't end there. I'm going to say something that's audacious, but the evidence for the resurrection still occurs today. That same transformation from kitten to lion still happens. And it's happened in my own life. You see, I used to be an atheist, and I was a committed atheist. I wasn't some kind of use atheism as an excuse to escape from thinking, I don't want to think about big problems, so I don't think about anything. No, I believed atheism. I wanted to understand atheism. I wanted to apply atheism. I took my atheism very seriously. But when the day came when I decided that the evidence for the existence of God was greater and the evidence that Jesus rose from the dead was greater, something happened very different in my life. Now, what I thought was going to happen is that I was agreeing to believe new things and I was agreeing to behave in a new way. What I never suspected was going to happen is that this God, this theoretical entity 1 billion miles away from me, that this God was going to come to me and meet with me personally and I would know him. I had no idea that he was going to transform my heart. He was going to transform my mind, totally change the course of my life. I did not see that coming. And you know what? Right here in this room, there are people here, and I want you to listen closely. If these 3 things are true of you, number 1, if you believe in the actual physical resurrection of Jesus, if you believe you actually have a personal relationship with the living God, and if your life has been radically transformed by this, I want you to raise your hand high right now. The witnesses to this resurrection aren't just found 2,000 years ago. The witnesses of those changed lives are still here in this room. And I have the audacity to say that this resurrection belief, that believing in Jesus, by turning away from your old way of doing things, you being the boss of your life and putting your hopes, your dreams, everything into the hands of a loving God, if you do that, that your life will be transformed just like ours have been. And you can interview any of the witnesses that you've seen, and they will tell you what's happened in their own lives. That what we see is not only an historical fact from long ago, but a present reality. I'm going to give you an opportunity right now to say a prayer that's so powerful that will change everything in your life. Because the Bible says that if we believe that God really rose Jesus from the dead, that Jesus really is the Son of God. The Bible says if we turn from our way of doing things, if we ask for forgiveness and we decide that we're going to follow Jesus and do things his way, put our hopes, our dreams, and our life in his hands, that God will forgive us. He will rescue us. He will come to know us, and that he will transform us. I want everybody to bow their heads right now, and I want you to pray after me. Dear God, I know I've messed up. There's things in my life I'm not proud of. And there's good things in my life I've failed to do. Following my own way of doing things has not worked out. And I want to put my trust in you. Lord, forgive me. Save me. Heal me. Use me. Amen.